redemption and to see the adults take part in such an act of worship. It's a really, really important thing. I remember when I was a kid, and we would take the Lord's Supper at church, and my dad was the pastor, and I always wanted to get a little snack, right? A little bite of the crackers or a little drink of that good old Welch's grape juice, right? Mom, Dad, it's just a snack, right? It's just a cracker, it's just juice. Why can't I have some? And just having that as an opportunity for them to share with me and to see in the way that the church did that. So I don't think the first time I led Lord's Supper last time, I was incredibly nervous. It's the first time that I had led it in some time, and I didn't have the kids stay last time, and I regret that. So I just want to let you know that I plan on that being part of it. Just because I want them to see. I want them to see how the church, and Lord willing, they will come to know Christ, and they too will sit beside us, and it will be nothing new to them. They will know, and they will see what the Lord has done for us. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste and see that the Lord is good. We are going to be in Luke chapter 6 this morning, talking about the Sabbath day, and that Jesus, we've talked about Jesus as more than a healer. We've talked about Jesus as more than a teacher. And today we talk about Jesus as more than just a man in the way that he reacts and what he says to some critiques about how he allows his disciples to live on the Sabbath day. Now, I want to make sure we understand what the Sabbath is, right? It's the seventh day of the week. We go back to the Genesis account in creation, where after God created things in 6 days, he didn't create in 7 days. He created in 6, by the way. He rested on the seventh day. And he sanctified it. He set it apart as holy. It is the Sabbath. It is a day of rest. If it were our calendar, it would be a Saturday, right? Sunday being the first day of the week. In the New Testament, we see the Lord's Day become almost a Christian Sabbath, where instead of just dwelling on creation on the Sabbath day and resting due to God's work there, we now remember the Lord's resurrection on the first day of the week. We join together as a church to commemorate that, to worship as we do, to take the Lord's Supper as we do, to fellowship as we do. All of that as a remembrance of him and as a celebration, and it's just a good thing, right? But that hasn't been instituted yet in the time that we're reading, because Jesus is still alive. He has not been crucified. He has not ascended to the right hand of the Father yet. So we don't have the first day of the week instituted as the Christian day of worship, which, by the way, if a church wants to gather on a Tuesday, it's okay. It's not like a Baptist law that it has to be Sunday morning and Wednesday night. Just in case anybody was confused, that's not in here. The Lord's Day, the first day of the week, is a special day for us, which is why we gather typically on Sundays. But we have the Sabbath, this day of rest. And in the first century here, again, we have the Pharisees, we have the Sadducees, we have these religious leaders whose job was to police, to make sure that the Jews were being good Jews, that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing on the Sabbath and things like that, which is a whole discussion as to what were they doing on the Sabbath, right? Besides just watching everybody else what they were doing. But we'll get into that. But the Sabbath day is a day of rest. So when we read on a Sabbath, chapter 6, verse 1, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? And Jesus answered them, Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God, and he took and he ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for anybody but the priests to eat. And he gave it also to those who were with him, and he said to them, The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now we'll get into verses 6 through 11 here shortly, but we have to understand that what Jesus is saying here to the Pharisees is a very big deal. We start with his disciples plucking and eating some heads of grain, and we go, why were they doing such a thing? It's a real spiritual, deep answer. They were hungry because they were walking, and it was time to eat, and they were hungry. Now, Old Testament law, Deuteronomy, tells us that while you cannot go up to your neighbor's field and use a sickle or any sort of like farm equipment, we would say, to harvest out of their field, if you are passing by their field, you are permitted by the law to grab some grain and to eat it if you are hungry and you need nourishment. All right, so this is a lawful act. So I don't want us to think that the Pharisees were upset because they grabbed the grain and, oh, that's somebody else's property, you guys are stealing. Nope, that was in the law. Completely normal act, by the way. People who traveled the roads would do that. You know, and when Israelites were to harvest their fields, they were to leave the corners and kind of the edges for passerbys and for people who did not have very much that they could eat off the fields. It was a good thing. But the Pharisees took issue. It says, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? Why are you breaking the Sabbath rules? Now, the Pharisees and the Jews at this time had a long list of things that you were not supposed to do on the Sabbath. You were not supposed to travel past a certain distance, except for if you were going to your own property, right? And so they would find nice loopholes. I read this story, which I've heard is an accurate description of how they behaved at this time, just to show you some of the hypocrisy that was at work. On Friday, the day before the Sabbath, a man would travel to his friend's house, which may have been beyond the bounds of how far he was supposed to travel on the Sabbath day. So he would go to his friend's house, and when he left his friend's house, he would leave his shoe there. And then when the Sabbath day came, he was permitted to walk that extra distance because he was retrieving his own property. You get the loophole there? It's silly. It's silly. But this is what they did. They set up all these fences so that nobody dare get close to even possibly breaking the Sabbath law. And the biggest Sabbath law was no working on the Sabbath, right? It is a day of rest, which we all would agree scripturally is true. The Sabbath was a day of rest. And Israel was supposed to keep the Sabbath and to keep it holy, to keep it separate. It was to be a special day of what? Reflecting on God. A day where you did not have to go out in the fields and work, but you instead worshiped the Lord. When you stayed at home, where there was a day of the week, and boy, doesn't this sound great, guys. A day of the week where it's not about cooking and cleaning and working and getting all that extra stuff done, but a day of just sitting and resting. Contemplating God, spending time in worship with your family. Oh, man, that sounds good, doesn't it? It's a good thing. It's a good thing. But what the Pharisees did through this is where we get the Pharisees as the villains here a little bit. What the Pharisees did is because they didn't want anybody to break that law, they set up all these fences further and further away. And they made it so that reaching out, maybe if you were walking alongside a grain field, reaching out and grabbing a handful of grain and doing this to get all of the extra stuff off the grain so that you could eat was work. Right? That it was labor. And therefore it was breaking God's law. And so they took issue with the fact that Jesus, again, he's the rabbi, he's the teacher. He's the instructor. And so how the disciples acted was a direct reflection on how he taught. So his disciples, just look at them all willy-nilly doing all that work on the Sabbath day. I mean, my goodness, they did this. Look at how much work they did. Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? And Jesus gives an illustration of David when he's on the run from Saul. David and his men are starving. They're starving. And they come to the house of God and they go to the priest and they say, and David says, do you have anything that we can eat? And the priest says, I don't have anything except for the bread of the presence, the bread that's only for the priests to eat. It's not for you, it's for us. But do you know what the priest did? He gave David the bread. I wonder why. Could it possibly have been because David was hungry? Could it possibly have been because David and his men were starving and needed nourishment? And so Jesus' illustration is, haven't you read about what David did when he was hungry? He and those that were with him, he entered the house of God. Now, he was given the bread, but Jesus, he says he took that bread. He ate it. Oh, that wicked David, right? No. Did David go into the house of the Lord in sin and ask for something to eat? And did the priest in sin feed a hungry man? Or perhaps, and he'll ask this question later on, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Is it lawful to do good? Or do you, just because you want to make it all about the fences, make it about what you don't do? And here's one of the temptations about, and I'll use the word for lack of a better word, religion, right? Yes, I know it's not a religion, it's a relationship. Yes, we'll have that conversation. Yeah. We partake in a relationship with God, and we exercise practically in our worship and in our life. That's the definition of a religious act, right? And what happens is we as Christians get so caught up, as the Pharisees did, in what not to do. So much so that even just Christianity as a whole only becomes about what you're not supposed to do. And we lose focus on what we are to do, right? So, oh, man. The Lord expects me not to have any fun, right? I can't have any fun. He doesn't want me to drink. He doesn't want me to smoke. He doesn't want me to swear. He doesn't want me to, you don't hear this very much, but go to the movies, right? He doesn't want me to do any of those things. He just wants me to be waiting at the door when the pastor unlocks it on Sunday morning. That's all he wants me to do. I don't get to have any fun. None. Or when you hear somebody say, well, I'm not into all of that because I want to do X, Y, Z. It becomes so much about what not to do. Now, guys, are there things we as believers should not do? Everybody nods their heads like this. Yes, of course. Of course. But did you know that Jesus didn't die for the not to? He died to give us life and to give it more abundantly to us. Right? To give us life here, to give us life after, and it was about so much more. Right? If it was just about the don't do, this would be one book, and it would be Leviticus. That's it. That would be it. This would be it. But we've got a lot more in here, because God, as Jesus has spoken to the Pharisees again, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. You get so caught up in the ritualistic acts that you forget what it's all about. You guys, you forgot that the Sabbath is not about abstaining. It's about what you're taking part in. It's about living for the Lord. Yes, it's about pushing aside all of the things in our life that separate us from that mindset, that distract us from that mindset, and instead doing exactly what the Lord would have us to do. So yes, we separate ourselves from work, and we do good. Right? We worship, that is good. And if somebody comes and wants to eat because they're hungry, it's good, even if that bread is the bread that's reserved for the priests. Then it's good that the priest should give bread because the man was hungry, he needed to eat. And in addition, he's using David, who is the king of kings, right? He is the king of Israel. David he's the man. David and Moses. You don't mess with David and Moses. You don't do that. You don't do that. And just by using David as an example, he tells the Pharisees, it's not about that. And guys, the Pharisees following people around and just nitpicking them on the Sabbath is violating the Sabbath. Just a heads up. To make it their business to do all of that is violating the Sabbath. And so he says to them, verse number 5, and he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is, in this way, saying, if anybody's going to say what's lawful and unlawful on the Sabbath, it's me. Because I am the Son of Man. I am the Messiah. I am God incarnate. I am the Creator. And if I tell my disciples that they may eat on the Sabbath in that way, guess what? I'm not going to break my own law. God is not above the law, right? It's not that he can do whatever he wants outside of the realm of the law and he has no... It's that everything in the law, including the Sabbath, matches perfectly his character and his nature. And so by being Lord over the Sabbath and permitting his disciples to eat, it shows us that it's not just about not doing things, but there is instead an opportunity for us to do good. And so we have an illustration here, verses 6 through 11, that can help us dive a little bit deeper into this. On another Sabbath, verse 6 says, he entered into the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath. Here's what the Pharisees and the Sadducees did. They weren't paying attention in order to catch somebody doing something wrong. Right? So it's the equivalent of somebody, no offense to people sitting in the back, I'm not talking about y'all, right? Somebody coming into church, sitting in the back and just kicking back and being like, all right, I'm watching. I'm watching all y'all. And when you do something, I'm going to get you. It's going to be bad. It's going to be, right? What are you here for, right? What are you here for? What are the Pharisees supposed to be taking part in? They're here in the synagogue. It was supposed to be for teaching. It's supposed to be for a time of worship, a time of learning about God, a time of explanation of his word. And what were the scribes and the Pharisees doing? They were just watching to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath. But because he's God in the flesh, it says in verse 8, but he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come and stand here. And he rose and he stood there. And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to destroy it? In Matthew's account, he asks them, in addition to this, which one of you, if his ox has fallen into a pit, will not on the Sabbath get it out of the pit? Right? What are you going to do? You're going to let that animal die? You're going to let that animal die for what? A rule you think you're instituting? Or is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Maybe the Sabbath is all about doing what is truly good for man to do, which is worship the Lord. Right? Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or destroy it? In both Matthew and Mark's account, it both notes that they were silent and they looked around at each other. I'm not answering this question. I'm not answering it. You answer it. I'm not going to answer it. You answer it. And specifically in Mark's account, Mark chapter 3, it says that this made Jesus angry. It says that it angered him, and he was angry with them because of the hardness of their hearts. Which shows us, first of all, Jesus was right. And they were unwilling to admit that Jesus was right. They were unwilling to admit that maybe they were out of step. Maybe they were doing something they were not supposed to be doing. That maybe the Sabbath is about doing good and not just about not doing something else. Right? And it says that after looking around at them, and again, Mark says that he was angry. He saw the hardness of their heart. It upset him. He says, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand, the hand of the man with the withered hand, was restored. Again, I say, man, what a sight that would have been. How cool would that be? How amazing would that be? And while I'm sure everybody else is going, what? Wow. It says in verse 11 that they, the scribes and the Pharisees, they were filled with fury. That ought to tell us enough about their heart condition right there. They were filled with fury, and they discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So because Jesus healed a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath in the synagogue, they were going to seek to kill him, to discredit him, to prove him to be wrong, all so that they could restore their way and their thoughts and their things. Now, I don't want us to read these accounts and misunderstand, right? There's one pastor that I listen to kind of frequently says, don't hear what I'm not saying. We're not saying that having standards of right and wrong is in and of itself wrong. No, like I said, there are things that we as Christians, no, we should not do. We should not partake in. Absolutely. But Christianity, our walk with Jesus, our faith, it's not about those things. Right? I'm not a Christian because I don't want to be a devil worshiper. I'm a Christian because I believe in Jesus. Do you understand the difference there? If the only reason that you partake in Christianity is because we don't want to do those things over there, and so by the process of elimination, I've ended up here, right? That by default, this is where I've ended up. You've come the wrong path. And the Jews, they got so trapped in this mindset. Well, we're Jews, we don't do those things. And it's about what we don't do. And we don't do that. And they lost track of what they were doing and ended up, they themselves, just living as hypocrites day in and day out. Because they were so busy policing these extra rules and these extra laws that Jesus says that they taught as God's law the commandments of men. That's not good. That's not good. It can't be about what we're not. It has to be about what we are. What are we for? Right? It's a lot like this. Anytime I've tried to go on a diet, as you can see, I've done very well. I struggle. Why? Why do I struggle with diets? Well, it's like this. Every time I eat, I think about all the things I can't have. And quickly, the diet becomes about all the things that I can't have this, so I must have this. Right? Well, even the psychologists and the psychiatrists and all that will tell you that's a terrible way to diet. What you need to do is instead train your mind to ignore that and just focus on what you should have and go in the right direction, not just look back at the wrong direction, right? It's hard. It's hard to do that. It's hard to do that with our faith. It's hard not to walk outside in the world, look around at all of the evil that's going on around us and go, ugh, and then just go in the other direction. But here's the problem. There may come a day when we walk out there and we don't say yuck with such an emphasis anymore. And all of a sudden those things are appealing to us, and then it's, well, what do I do with that? What do I do with that? Because it's not so much about Jesus as much as it is about the do's and the don'ts. But what if I want to do and not don't, right? That makes sense, doesn't it? That's a proper sentence. It must be about Christ. It must be about God. It must be about His glory. It must be about His holiness. It must be about what He has done for us, not the other things that we just can't do anymore. When Jesus says, I am Lord of the Sabbath, and He heals the man on the Sabbath, and He asks them, is it not good to do good things on the Sabbath? He's showing them the Sabbath is not about not doing, but it's instead about doing the right thing, which is loving the Lord and loving one another. You know, if you're ever coming to church, you're driving to church, and somebody needs help, and you're like, I'm late, I can't help. And this, I'm speaking to myself as well. I'm late, I can't help. Y'all help. Let's help people. Let's love people, right? I'll make you a deal. You do that, you help. I promise the next Sunday I'm not going to drag you in front of everybody. Where were you last week? You know, where were you? I'll shine a light in your eyes like a police interrogation. Do good. We want to love people. We want to care for people. And that is a good thing. That is good for us to do. We want to love the Lord. And when we do the things that we do, and we don't do things, let it be born out of a love for God. May it be born out of, I don't want to take part in those things because it breaks the heart of my Lord. Because it breaks him. Because everything that's about goes against everything I'm supposed to be for. Not just because, oh, that's disgusting. What happens when it's no longer disgusting to you? What happens when you become so desensitized by the culture that you don't view it as that bad of a thing anymore? Then what? But the holiness of God does not change. The glory of God does not change. The character of God does not change. The goalpost there doesn't change. But if we go based off of, well, I want this or I want that. I mean, just the other day, I changed what I wanted for dinner halfway through the day. Like, we flip-flop all the time. It must be about him. Let me ask you, believers, is your walk with Christ about him more than it's about you? Is it about his glory? Is it about pleasing him? Is it about growing closer to him? Or is it merely about what we get out of it? Is it merely about the stat, and I use quotes here, the status we get as a Christian, right? Well, I'm a Christian because it makes the liberals mad. That's not a good reason, y'all. That's not a good reason. I'm just going to tell you, don't do that, right? That's not a good reason. Here's a good reason to obey the Lord, because you love the Lord. That's why, right? Why did the priest give David the bread? Because the man's hungry, and the priest loves the Lord, and knows that to feed the hungry is a good thing. Because the Lord is good, and the Lord cares for the needy, and he wants his people to care for the needy. There we go. And also, David is God's anointed, but, well, you know. But it's a good thing to do. Why did Jesus let his disciples eat on the side of the road that day, knowing that they would make those Pharisees so mad? They were hungry. Let them eat lunch. And it's a good thing. He cared about them. These were his friends. These were his brothers. It's a good thing. So I just want to encourage you. Jesus, and through this, before I get to that, before this, Jesus also shows himself as the Lord of the Sabbath. He's more than just a man who's under the Sabbath, right? He's not just an everyday Jew who is seeking to follow the law. I made the law. And I made the law, so I know how to follow the law. And we're doing just fine, right? I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I command it. All of creation cycles on God's time. All of creation, all the time, cycles on God's time. And Jesus is the Lord of all creation. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the Lord of today. He's the Lord of tomorrow. And that argument in and of itself gave the Pharisees no room for discussion. And there's a reason they did not discuss it. And I want us to also think about this. Is when we are confronted by God's word with things like this, how do we take it? Is it the, no, you answer. No, you answer. Or do we humble ourselves before him? It's a good thing to do good on the Sabbath. It's a good thing to do good on the Lord's Day. It's also a good thing to humble ourselves before God and say, Lord, I've been doing it for the wrong reason this whole time. Or, I started out doing it for the right reason, right? This is probably what happens more than anything. I started out, when I first got saved, with such a fervor for you. I just wanted to please you. You know, when I was saved as a kid, what really led me to Jesus was I wanted to make him happy. And my parents had taught me through the scriptures that God wanted that relationship with me. And that having that relationship would please him. And so even my salvation was man, I just wanted to make God happy. And I guess I can talk through my own walk here. I started out fervent, even as a kid. And I was in front of we had this electric fireplace in our living room in our house, and I'd sit in front of that and I'd read the Bible. Then I got a little older, and my fervor died down a little bit. Died down a little bit more, died down a little bit more, and then pretty soon it was just about being a Christian, not about loving the Lord. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt, it doesn't fit anymore. Right? I grew, got through that process. I think it happens to Christians. We get into a mindset, especially with how awful the world tends to become at times, we forget what it's all about. And we become just those that are against. And we don't tell people nearly enough what we are for, and what is good, and what is right. I encourage you, Christian, to examine yourself, to think on this. Do I serve him because I love him? Do I obey him because I love him and I care about him? And about my neighbor? Or is it simply about me and having my way? That is the dangerous place that the Pharisees found themselves in. We're going to have a song here in just a moment. I'll have the praise team come up and get ready here, but I want to encourage you guys. We are blessed beyond measure with a love, a God that loves us, who is merciful to us, and we can come to him in times like this and say, Lord, I'm messed up. And God never will turn us away of his forgiveness and his love and his mercy. I want to encourage you, and if you want to stand with me, we'll prepare our hearts for a song. I want to encourage you that Jesus is that Lord for us. May we care for him. May we love him. May we desire to do what he would have us to do and not do what he would not have us to do because we love him and because we want to be united with him, because we care about what he cares about, and because we want to please our master. He laid his life down for us as we celebrated and we remembered this morning. He laid his life down for us. And he cares that much about us. Man, it's so good. I'm so thankful for that. I want to encourage you at this time, if you want to talk or pray, I'm here. Pastor Steve is here as well. You have neighbors sitting around you. If you want to talk or pray with one of them, tug on their shirt, say, hey, would you pray with me? If you want to sing, sing. If you need to sit, sit. If you want to stand and pray, do your thing. This is just a time of reflection to close out the service as we sing together.